Meeting session. Welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman, delighted to welcome so many of you on this beautiful afternoon. Glad you found us here. I'm delighted as always to co-chair this seminar session with Professor Erik Arnesen from George Washington University, and to acknowledge our partnership with the National History Center. We've now been running this seminar together for 3 or 4 years. 4 or 5 or 6, oh gosh. Since I was there at the creation, I should know, but anyhow, delighted to have so many of you here for this very intriguing session on looking for the stranger, Albert Camus, in the life of a literary classic. Erik will introduce our featured speaker today, Professor Alice Kaplan, in just a moment. Let me, as always, acknowledge the support we get from our teams, various teams, Peter Bierstecker, my team all the way in the back, and Amanda Perry. Did I see Amanda hiding in the back? Amanda, the assistant director at the National History Center. Thank you so much for your help getting us organized. The seminar is sponsored by the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, the George Washington University History Department, and a number of other donors. We really appreciate their support. Let me ask you to quiet your cell phones or other devices that you have on you so we can be focused on today's lecture and discussion. And let me say next week we'll meet here at the same time to launch Greg Brzezinski's new book on winning the Third World, Sino-American competition during the Cold War. But now it's over to Erik and Alice.
Thank you. It is my real pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Alice Kaplan, who is the John M. Musser Professor of French at Yale University. She is a specialist in 20th century France. She works at the intersection of literature and history using a method that allies archival research with textual analysis. She is a former Guggenheim Fellow, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a recipient of the French Legion d'Honneur, as well as the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History for her earlier work, The Collaborator, published in 2000. Recent books include Dreaming in French, published in 2012, and Looking for the Stranger, Albert Camus and the Life of a Literary Classic. And this afternoon, she will be speaking on the subject of that book, How L'étranger Became the Stranger, Literary Translation, and the Long Life of a Classic. Alice Kaplan.
Thank you so much. I was so pleased to be invited by the National History Seminar. I want to thank all the people who helped organize, Peter Bierstecker and Amanda Perry, and our moderators, Erik Arnesen and Christian Osterman. This is in some way a talk about foreign relations, and you will see how. But first I have a question. I want to know, with a show of hands, how many of you have read Camus' novel, The Stranger? Self-selecting audience, right? How many have read it in French? And how many in English? Oh, it's fantastic. Okay, so you're the ideal audience. You are also one of over 10 million people who've read the novel in over 60 languages. Reading The Stranger is a rite of passage. People all over the world connect the book to their coming of age, to grappling with the toughest questions of existence. The story of Meursault, a man whose name contains a plunge, un saut, into death, meurt, is a deceptively simple one. His mother dies in an old people's home, and he travels to her funeral. When he gets back, he goes swimming with a girlfriend and takes her to the movies. He writes a letter for a friend who's a pretty rough character. He kills an Arab on a beach in Algiers. He is tried and sentenced to death, and as the novel ends, he awaits execution. It's not much to go on. Yet The Stranger is as gripping and puzzling today as it was in 1942, with its images both ordinary and unforgettable. A view out the balcony on a lazy Sunday, the whimper of a dog being beaten, the light shooting off a steel knife, and 4 quick knocks on the door of unhappiness, echoes of a stupid vigilante killing. It's easy to forget that there's nothing natural about The Stranger's success. It's been a bestseller for so long, we forget it was ever anything else. But literary classics are made, not born, and so today I want to tell you one part of a very complex story about how The Stranger, a book very few readers understood or appreciated when it was published in 1942, became a household name, a regular on lists of the great books of the century, cited in this country in the company of other classics, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. I'm going to focus on a key episode in The Stranger's American career, the first translation of the novel into English in the United States and in England 4 years after its publication in 1946. The war in Europe had been over for only a year. The story I'm about to tell you is a tale of 2 cities involving an author, his publishers, his translator, and his readers and reviewers. Although few Americans had read L'Étranger when it first came out in French, it had been almost impossible to find a copy in wartime France, word of the novel had crossed the ocean. Blanche Knopf, who founded Knopf with her husband Alfred in 1915, had a special interest in publishing translations of contemporary European literature. She had been cut off from France for the duration of the war, but by February 1945, she was back in touch with her agent in Paris. Sartre, the great Sartre, had lauded a new Camus novel, still in manuscript, called The Plague, in a lecture he gave at Harvard in 1945. Blanche Knopf cabled Paris asking to see the manuscript. The Plague, with its link to the suffering and heroism of France during the German occupation, was bound to make a splash, and she understood that Knopf might also have to buy The Stranger in order to get The Plague, which she considered a more exciting and relevant book. Alfred Knopf cabled the agent, Bradley, in February, eager to acquire The Plague, but Camus hadn't finished the novel. Knopf hesitated. In March 1945, he decided to make an offer of $350 for translation rights on The Stranger, with an option to buy rights for The Plague when it was finished. And the British were somewhat more enthusiastic than the Americans. Cyril Conley, a magazine editor and critic, a real eccentric, who was on record declaring that the European novel was a wasteland, saw a whole new start for fiction itself in what Camus had written. He brought The Stranger immediately to the attention of publisher Jamie Hamilton, who purchased British rights in February 1945 with an advance of £75. Hamilton asked Conley to provide an introduction, and Hamilton also chose the translator, Stuart Gilbert, a friend of James Joyce, who had a good track record translating novels like Man's Fate by André Malraux. Knopf and Hamilton agreed to share translation costs. In June, Blanche Knopf made her first post-war buying trip to Paris and finally met Camus in person in her old spot at the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme. She liked to meet authors early in the day, smoking Chesterfields on a couch in the hotel's vast corridor, a space that remained quiet until afternoon tea was served. She would ask for information about up-and-coming French writers, and she was known to say, "That's not good enough for America," when she didn't like a suggestion. With Camus, however, she let down her guard and listened. It was the beginning of a long and devoted literary friendship. Stuart Gilbert worked fast. By September 1945, he'd sent his complete manuscript to Knopf and Hamilton with instructions and with a title, The Stranger. On January 10th, Jamie Hamilton sent corrected galleys of the translation to Blanche Knopf in New York. And by galleys, of course, I mean the bound typeset pages that always precede a published book, allowing author and editor to make last-minute corrections. But there was a bombshell in his letter, the announcement of a fait accompli. Let me see, here it is. I send you herewith a set of corrected galleys of Camus' L'Étranger, which we have decided to call The Outsider, both because we consider this a more striking and appropriate title than The Stranger, and because Hutchinson's recently called one of their Russian novels The Stranger. So in 1945, Hutchinson's, a rival British publisher, released what was actually a Polish novel in English translation, which bore the unfortunate title, The Stranger. Hamilton feared that Camus' book might be confused with it. On the New York end, it was too late to switch titles from The Stranger to The Outsider. Hamilton was sending galleys, but these galleys were as unexpected as the title change, for Knopf had already typeset the book for themselves so that it could be available for Camus' visit to New York that spring. Blanche Knopf responded tersely to Hamilton's announcement. And here's her letter. I had assumed when I received the manuscript, because it had instructions on it from Stuart Gilbert, it was setting copy. We read it very carefully and made any necessary corrections. Certainly, if I'd known there was a chance of corrected galleys, I would not have set, and I wish you might have cabled me the new title, which I can well understand you're using. Hamilton hadn't cabled, nor had he telephoned. This was the immediate post-war world. Obviously, there was no internet, no cell phones, but I think even harder for us to imagine in our contemporary context is the fact that people didn't just pick up the phone in London to call New York. Knopf and Hamilton, the two publishers, may have shared the English language, but they were separated by a vast ocean and very different expectations. On the English side, it hadn't occurred to Jamie Hamilton that Knopf would go to the trouble of producing the book separately without waiting for his own galleys. Was Hamilton being patronizing? Was Knopf being presumptuous? The combination of an assumption for control on the British side and an assumption of independence on the American side make for a fine allegory of British-American relations going back to the revolution that separated us. For years, no one has been able to explain why Camus' L'Étranger has two different English language titles. An Algerian critic argued recently in a review of Sandra Smith's 2013 translation of L'Étranger for Viking England that the title, The Outsider, is politically scandalous, for it effaces the ambiguity in the French word l'étranger and substitutes a more banal idea of someone being excluded. He thought, this Algerian critic, thought that Smith's 2013 title was new, not realizing that the British have used that same title since 1946. The two titles tempt us to fill in the blanks with cultural or political theories. Certainly I had them. I had imagined, so for example, that in Melting Pot, New York, the immigrant firm of Knopf had a sense of foreignness that directed them towards the stranger, whereas Hamilton in class-conscious Britain was more aware of social exclusion, hence the outsider. This is, a literary historian's fantasy world. Neither theories hold water, as we see from this exchange between Hamilton and Knopf. Only marketing issues and timing explain why L'Étranger was born into the English language as fraternal twins. Same text, different typography, covers, and titles. I like to think of the two editions as existentialist twins. The doubling has continued to this day, even as new translations have replaced Gilbert's. No matter who is translating, the British edition is called The Outsider, the American edition, The Stranger. Books about the stranger, the outsider, when they're published in the US and England, have to change titles in each edition or risk disorienting readers. Yeah, existentialist twins, right? If you ask someone, English or American, which title they prefer, chances are they will answer the one I'm used to. And in discussion, it would be great to talk about which title you prefer and why. The British edition of The Outsider bore a cover featuring an Arab in strong mosaic design and a critical introduction by Cyril Connolly. What strikes me about this design is that the Arab represented does not look anything like an Algerian Arab from those years. He looks more like a Saudi Arabian Arab, right? So I think there's a certain amount of British projection going on. Connolly reminded readers in a really remarkable introduction that's been completely forgotten. He reminded readers that Algeria was a colony of France and that Camus seemed to give to the Arab characters in the novel, particularly the Moorish woman, beaten and reviled, none of the sympathetic attention to their dilemma that he had given to Meursault. Connolly was writing with an acute sense that India was about to gain its independence from the British Empire, which was fading, despite, or perhaps because of the political salvo launched from the book's introduction. Jamie Hamilton was certain he had a bestseller on his hands, and he planned a first print run of 10,000 copies, over twice Gallimard's wartime print run of 4,400 in Paris. At Knopf in New York, there was much more hesitation. In-house readers' reports were less than stellar. See if you can even recognize the novel you've read in their remarks. Herbert Weinstock, opera specialist, that says it all, right? Opera specialist and Knopf advisor had this to say about The Stranger, quote, "This extended short story, the translation does not exceed 30,000 words, is pleasant, unexciting reading. It seems to me neither very important or very memorable, and it also seems to me to be padded with extraneous detail." He attributed the piling up of details, the flat tone, and what he called, quote, deliberate artlessness to, quote, a philosophic theory called existentialism, of which The Stranger could be considered a demonstration. Quote, "My best guess is that it will appeal to very few readers and produce something less than a sensation." Another advisor called L'Étranger, quote, "too slight to be worth translating." And this advisor filed a report with Knopf in January 1945, dissatisfied with the scene that has gone down in literary history as the most stunning part of the novel. Quote, "The actual moment of the shooting is not altogether convincing. The turning point in the story isn't credible. The book is limited." So Knopf had its work cut out. Here's this first American edition with a kind of, ambiguous figure. We don't know if this is the Arab, the Frenchman, whatever. Knopf had its work cut out. As The Stranger was about to go on sale in American bookstores, the publisher placed a full-page ad in Publishers Weekly. It was signed by Blanche Knopf and entitled "On the New Literature of France." Actually, Blanche Knopf convinced Justin O'Brien, a professor in the Columbia French department, to ghostwrite the ad. She wrote to O'Brien, "The bookstores are not buying this novel and do not know anything about the entire French trend. Jamie Hamilton always referred to it as Blanche's existentialist ad. She was going to do everything possible to make The Stranger accessible and exciting. And it's really hard to imagine Publishers Weekly today doing a full-page ad to explain, say, post-colonialism or deconstruction. But there she was, all ready to go. So the advertisement began by sympathizing with the average reader's dilemma. It says, she writes, "There is no use trying to talk about new French literature unless you are willing to tackle existentialism. Now, this is a frightening word. Everyone likes to show that he can pronounce it, but no one enjoys undertaking to define it. Well, here goes. Existentialism," the ad continued, "is the notion that a consciousness of the universe's meaninglessness can make us free. Passing mention was then made of the fact that Camus, whose somber countenance gazed out from the upper right of the page, refused to be classified with the existentialists because their emphasis on meaninglessness was at odds with his belief in political justice. The author of The Stranger was introduced as a man who had lived a double life during the occupation, publishing with the approval of the Nazi censor while editing a resistance newspaper underground. The Stranger was then presented in a few words, a novel as simple and straightforward as John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Pitching The Stranger as both a lofty existentialist novel and a straightforward populist novel was clever, since reviewers could pick up on either strand, high or low. Pitching Camus as an existentialist and a champion for social justice was also a good idea. Here was an author both intelligent and heroic. After a month of what Blanche Knopf considered fantastic press, 2,500 copies of the novel had sold. In 1946, The Stranger was not yet a bestseller. In the long run, though, I think the ad accomplished something far more important than immediate sales. It introduced Camus to American magazine and newspaper publishers as a leading figure of a school of French literature called existentialist, and it established that school as the most important new intellectual current coming out of France. You would have to read this advertisement in Publishers Weekly twice over to glean that Camus disavowed the existentialist label. And in fact, he detested it. He joked in an interview with a French magazine that he and Sartre decided they ought to put out their own ad stating that the undersigned have nothing in common and refuse to respond to any debts they might have incurred mutually. Yet it was Sartre who prepared the way for Camus' New York welcome. Sartre described Camus in Vogue magazine as the emblematic writer to emerge from the resistance, the only writer who corresponded to his theory of a committed literature essential to the renewal of France. As Blanche Knopf learned, Sartre had read an early version of Camus' forthcoming novel, The Plague, in manuscript, and he was ready to vouch that the world was about to see a new Camus. The absurdity of the world in The Stranger and the myth of Sisyphus gave way in this new work, The Plague, to positive revolt and struggle. The Plague, based on Camus' own commitment to the resistance, demonstrated that the human spirit could come to rule over the absurd world. Sartre made Camus a key to the future of literature. And he spoke in English and said, "It is likely that in the somber, pure work of Camus are discernible the principal traits of the French letters, that is, the French literature of the future." For Sartre, whose influence was then tremendous, Camus represented most vividly the aspirations of post-war literature at a shining moment when writers and intellectuals felt the world was theirs to remake. No other writer, I think, could have fit the bill for Sartre. Malraux was too much of an individualist. Guénaud and Mauriac, much older men, had chosen to publish nothing above ground, while the communists were indebted to their own masters. Camus had done exactly what needed to be done during the occupation. He had marked time, but he hadn't accepted the oppression. He had chosen struggle rather than silence. 32 years old in 1945, he had reached the perfect age when youth meets maturity. Back in the US in January 1946, and speaking to students at Yale about the French view of the American novel, Sartre singled out The Stranger as, quote, the French novel which caused the greatest furor between 1940 and 1945. He focused on Camus' debt to Hemingway, the short, disruptive sentences, which in Hemingway were a feature of the writer's temperament, but in Camus seemed rather to be a deliberate technique for expressing a philosophy of the absurd. Sartre said that each sentence of the novel was like an island, separated from the next sentence by a sense of nothingness. Then he entertained his audience with stories of the symbolic value of American literature under German occupation. He described the Café de Flore on the Boulevard Saint-Germain-des-Prés as the headquarters for a black market in American books. Not only did reading Faulkner and Hemingway novels become a symbol of resistance, he claimed, it was even the case, he could not resist a sexist joke, that secretaries believed they could demonstrate against the Germans by reading Gone with the Wind in the metro. Sartre promised his audience 3 months before the English language publication of The Stranger that the first French novels written during the occupation were about to appear in the United States. He was rolling out a thick red carpet for his friend. So a lot of preparation went into the publication of The Stranger in the US. After the confusion over the title, the tepid readers' reports, and the big push of the publisher's weekly ad, came one more important step: a visit by the author to the United States under the auspices of the cultural services of the French embassy. In the second half of my lecture, then, I'd like to recount that visit and the initial reactions of the American public to L'Étranger in translation. When the SS Oregon docked in the New York harbor on March 24, 1946, Camus was the only passenger held for questioning by immigration officials. He refused to answer any of their questions, which surely included what was then the standard for Cold War America: are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And indeed he had for 2 short years in Algeria. He was silent for several hours until a staff member from French Cultural Services intervened and vouched for the writer. Word of the incident reached J. Edgar Hoover, always on the lookout for the communist menace. Hoover ordered FBI surveillance and a report. Freedom of Information gives us the report. The FBI's major source of information was a light-hearted article published by Hannah Arendt in the left-wing magazine The Nation, a month before Camus' arrival in Manhattan. In the French Existentialist, I have that somewhere here. Here we go. In French Existentialism, Hannah Arendt claimed that France had become a place where books so difficult as to require actual thinking sell like detective stories. The French existentialists were having more fun than any other intellectuals in the post-war world, and the 2 main representatives of this new existentialist movement were Sartre and Camus. After quoting Arendt at length, the FBI report de-escalated the threat, pointing out that with the liberation, even the communists in France had turned to nationalist concerns and to the reconstruction of their country. In the end, Special Agent Tierney concluded, there was really nothing to worry about. The unknown Agent Tierney is a hero of the story. for another agent might have given in to the reigning Cold War paranoia. Here's what he wrote. Investigation fails to develop any subversive or political activity on subject's part. Informants state they believe subject is striving in his lectures to establish a closer relationship between the cultural views of the US and France and to explain the philosophy of the absurd. This philosophy, he continues, recommends living lucidly with the absurd, enjoying life all the more fully because it had no meaning, and taking advantage of the most complete liberty on earth once eternal liberty is suppressed. Where is Agent Turney when we need him today? Waiting patiently at Pier 88 to greet Camus that spring day was Nicola Chiaramonte, an Italian friend who had sought refuge with Camus and his family in Algiers and Oran in 1941. He'd accompanied Camus on bike trips to the beach that inspired The Stranger. He'd lived with Camus' in-laws in downtown Oran. Chiaramonte had found safe passage to New York through Algeria, Morocco, and Portugal with Camus' help, and it was time to return Camus' hospitality. The Italian refugee was now a prominent New York intellectual, publishing in the best small magazines. There would be no quiet walks on the beach for Camus and Chiaramonte, but instead many loud parties and evenings in honky-tonk bars and fancy New York apartments. Blanche and Alfred Knopf threw a swank party to launch The Stranger on the rooftop garden of the Astor Hotel in Times Square, but Camus didn't even mention it in his New York diary. Despite what the existentialist ad said, the novel he had conceived in 1939 and perfected in the depths of the occupation no longer corresponded to his thinking or his mood. The specialist of the flat first-person narrative, the creator of the alienated and solitary Meursault, had earned the right and privilege to step onto the lecture stage and speak as we, representing the aspirations of liberated France. 4 days after his arrival, Camus lectured at Columbia University. The event was a panel on post-war France, conceived and organized by the great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss in 1946 was the cultural attaché in the New York offices of the French embassy. Camus was joined by 2 writers published by the legendary underground press, the Éditions de Minuit, Vercors, author of a little novella some of you must know, Silence of the Sea, Silence de la Mer, and a mathematician essayist named Timeret. The event at Columbia was the talk of the town. Camus was hosted by Professor Justin O'Brien, the 20th century French literature specialist in the Columbia French department, who had only recently traded in his uniform for a professor's tweed coat, and who had written the famous existentialist ad for Blanche Knopf. O'Brien announced in the New York Herald Tribune that Camus was the boldest writer in France today. The Columbia Spectator, the student newspaper, prepared the student body for Camus' talk. Quote, Camus, however, appears to live happily within this absurd and not to sacrifice his lucidity and contentedness at the altar of metaphysical revelation. It was a kind of reassuring take on the myth of Sisyphus. Why be bogged down in the absurd when life is so much fun? The day before the event, O'Brien called on Camus and the other speakers at the Embassy, a mothy hotel at 70th and Broadway. Quote, the moment we were in his room and the athletic young man had stretched out on the bed with a few notes in front of him, he easily dominated the group. Camus' charisma, made of equal parts of physical presence, ease, and authority, worked its magic on men and women alike. O'Brien's impression of Camus as athletic may have been fanciful and certainly belied Camus' tenuous health. The young writer had survived the occupation, but he was suffering from the effects of a relapse of his adolescent tuberculosis that had struck him hard in 1942, that he hadn't been able to shake. Try then to imagine the scene, a huge audience gathered in Columbia's Macmillan Theater, more than the university had ever seen for an event in French. 1,200 people crowded into a space designed for 600, some of them carrying copies of Combat. Camus was editor-in-chief of this newspaper, which had begun underground as part of a resistance movement and now represented the aspirations for a new, more just society in liberation France. O'Brien remembered everyone was eager to hear French spoken again and to see in flesh and blood some survivors of the black years of the occupation. Here are the other two speakers. So in his speech at Columbia called The Human Crisis, Camus mentioned neither the stranger nor the myth of Sisyphus. Speaking in French, he described his generation, born during the First World War, reaching adolescence during the Depression, coming of age during the Civil War in Spain, Munich, and the defeat, and living through an enemy occupation. He spoke with no regret of the fashion for the absurd that had captured writers such as himself before the war, and of a literature that was in revolt against clarity, narration, and even the sentence. This was no longer his world. Camus was preoccupied, as were the characters in his novel In Progress, The Plague, with preventing the return of a deadly scourge. Like an epidemic brought under control, Hitler's death ended one cycle of evil, but it should not make them complacent. Camus called for the elimination of the death penalty, for dialogue across borders, for indulgence towards others and rigor towards oneself, and he praised the Frenchmen who'd been willing to die for the truth. He likened them to so many modern-day Socrates. After the losses from 2 world wars, he suggested, France would doubtless see history being made by other nations. French writers and thinkers faced a daunting task. They needed to emerge from the era of Nazism with pessimism about the world and optimism about mankind. And if you're interested in this speech, you can see on YouTube, we had it reenacted in 2016 with Viggo Mortensen reading the Camus text in an English translation. Same theater, same campus, same date. It was really a remarkable event. But here's what interested me for our purposes today. A writer for The New Yorker who visited Camus in his room at the Embassy Hotel found him studying the Knopf edition of his novel with a puzzled expression on his face. Camus didn't read English very well, but he knew something was wrong. There are too many quotations in it, he told his visitor. I am sure there weren't that many quotations in the original. So you can see it best in this chart. Any chance he got, Stuart Gilbert used quotations. Even a passing remark like, I answered no, became, in Gilbert's version, I answered no. The change had huge consequences in tone and style in the reader's relationship to Meursault, because while Camus had chosen to use indirect speech to distance the reader from his narrator, to deprive us of direct dialogue, Guilford preferred to report speech directly. Did he think it made the story livelier? It's impossible to know. In any case, his change created an entirely different mood. Like many talented translators faced with radical literary innovation, Gilbert wanted to make the stranger sound good in idiomatic English. But he changed the style so drastically that anyone who knew the French and happened upon this version was appalled. 30 years later, a French professor named John Gale who'd been asked to lecture on the novel to a group of students reading it in English, was so taken aback by his first contact with Gilbert Stranger that he wrote a manifesto called "Does America Know the Stranger?" And here are some of his damning examples, right? So Gilbert translates "j'arriverai" as "I should get there," and "ce n'est pas de ma faute" as "sorry, sir, but it's not my fault, you know." Je ne sais pas in the French becomes "I can't be sure" in English. Meursault isn't indifferent in this translation, he just can't make up his mind. Camus writes, "Je prendrai l'autobus à 2 heures et j'arriverai dans l'après-midi." I'll take the bus at 2 and I'll arrive in the afternoon. And Gilbert translates, "With the 2 o'clock bus, I should get there well before nightfall." Gilbert substitutes complex sentence structures for Camus' stripped-down sentences. And he asserts causality that Camus worked so hard to avoid. Gilbert's sentences are no longer the islands that so fascinated Sartre in the original. Gilbert also gives the novel a bit of a cultural upgrade. Even Raymond Santez, the pimp, sounds British. Quote, I think I have this on a slide. "You've knocked around the world a bit," Santez says to Meursault in Gilbert's translation, where Camus reports the conversation indirectly. "He wanted to ask my advice. Since I was a man, I knew life. Il voulait me demander un conseil, que moi j'étais un homme, je connaissais la vie." Camus had landed in New York on March 25, 1946. On April 11, a more hesitant, classier, and vaguely more British Meursault stepped gingerly onto the pavements of American literature. In reviews from April to July 1946, there was a discrepancy between the political spokesman of 1946 and the solitary writer of The Stranger. Existentialism, from what American critics had read, appeared to be a practical and hopeful philosophy designed to pull France and the rest of the world out of the wartime morass. But the man in his novel didn't match. Camus, preoccupied with political change, had moved beyond the absurd. But The Stranger couldn't. It would forever be the fruit of Camus' solitude in Oran and Paris, the book conceived before the fall of France. The American press tried to make sense of the novel as a reflection of its author, who in their minds represented the resistance, and certain articles forced the connection. View, a stylish New York surrealist magazine, published a disdainful review of The Stranger by Nicholas Callas. Callas understood Meursault as a pure collaborator who doesn't lose himself in action, but abandons hope and becomes a cynic. Camus' friend Carol Monte reviewed Gilbert's translation in The New Republic. For him, there was a deep connection between Meursault's refusal to lie and Camus' own honesty, which gave The Stranger in his mind an ethical force that differentiated it from any of the American novels to which it was compared. His Meursault resisted. The Talk of the Town column in The New Yorker published a sketch entitled The Absurdist. The magazine brought the French literary star down to size by describing him as a cartoonish-looking character whose skinny frame showed the effects of the occupation diet and whose suit was 10 years out of date. There were all these Talk of the Town a little snarky there. Camus, in his own diaries, complained about American bad taste, the ugliest neckties he had ever seen. He wrote to Janine and Michel Gallimard, his friends in Paris, that the girls at Vogue were calling him the little Bogart, and he figured he could probably get a film contract whenever he wanted. One young journalist at Vogue named Patricia Blake became his American companion, and she grew close enough to Camus to notice his sudden sweats and fevers, without quite realizing that he was suffering from tuberculosis. Camus went on tour to several East Coast campuses. Like Simone de Beauvoir a year later, but in a more ironic key, he was amazed by American students, especially the women. At Vassar College on April 6, 1946, he wrote, quote, "An army of young starlets who recline on the lawns with their long legs crossed. What they do for young people here is worth remembering." He was only 32, but with the war and the underground struggle behind him, not to mention his poor health, Camus felt decades older than those students. He wasn't the first European to complain about American optimism. "In this country," he wrote, "everything is done to prove that life is not tragic, and the young people feel as if something is missing." And he added, "This effort is pathetic because you have to reject the tragic after looking at it, but not before." Meanwhile, the literary establishment continued to pronounce both on The Stranger and on its author. In the Sunday New York Times, John L. Brown wrote from Paris. He knew Camus' literary circle very well, and he explained that Camus was the person to whom the tormented, uncertain, often unbalanced, but always courageous adolescents of post-liberation France come to discuss their problems with someone who they feel understands them better than anyone else. His Camus was an apostle. The Stranger didn't fare very well with Edmund Wilson in The New Yorker. He found the novel sociologically inconsistent. If what Meursault wants is to keep the Arabs in their place, and even that isn't sure, he ought to be shown as himself being kicked or squeezed by some other social group. In other words, Wilson wanted a realist novel. Charles Poor also wrote about Algeria. A journeyman critic for the New York Times who'd served with the Civil Affairs Division in North Africa and Italy, he was the first U.S. critic to address the men who had landed on the coast of Algeria in 1942. And I have to remind my students who know D-Day inside out that the Allies liberated North Africa in November 1942. Poor writes, "The scene of The Stranger is Algiers, right? Not the Algiers full of Allied uniforms and armament and confusion and jeeps roaring up the Rue Michelet that so many Americans have known, but a purely French and Arab Algiers of some time before the war hit that steep town. The frying wet heat of summer, however, is familiar." It's a beautiful review. Brown didn't make the darker connection between Meursault's crime and the Second World War. The fact that millions of Americans, whether they had fought in Normandy, in North Africa, or in the Pacific, were living with the memory of killing a nameless enemy. To them, The Stranger held out a dark and grimly satisfying mirror. As for the Arab in the story, Poor remarked, but only in parentheses, incidentally, the fate of the Arab's family is completely overlooked in the proceedings. It would be several decades before American critics grappled with that aspect of the novel. I'll leave you with a mystery. Despite the real problems of the Gilbert translation, despite the tensions between Camus' persona and his novel, readers seemed to grasp what was essential. The novel took hold. I can't explain it. Maybe it helped that Pantheon Books published a French language edition of L'Étranger in New York in 1946. There were many Americans in those days who could read the original. The Pantheon edition was the exact negative of one of Gallimard's traditional white covers, an homage to L'Étranger's birthright that dressed the book in post-war mourning. We know that 40 years after the first U.S. translation of The Stranger, Charles Poor's parenthetical remark about the Arab would become absolutely central. The Stranger, marketed by Blanche Knopf in 1946 as a philosophical expression of existentialism, would morph into a much more political book. And students and teachers would begin to debate, as Cyril Connolly proposed in his introduction, the meaning of a story where the Arab victim has no name and no language. The life of a book goes on well beyond the life of its author. It grows and changes, expands and contracts with new generations of readers. Its good health, its very survival, is dependent upon the new questions we ask of it. Which brings me to conclude. In 2013, Kamel Daoud, an Algerian writer, published a novel about the brother and mother of Meursault's victim called The Meursault Investigation. He gives Meursault's Arab victim a name, Moussa, and he gives him a surviving brother named Haroun, who tries with difficulty to find out what happened to the writer who killed his brother in a book. He's created a fascinating mix of criticism and fiction, both dependent on the plot of The Stranger, but ultimately flying free from its sources. Camus' bold repurposing is only one example in a 75-year-old history of reinventions of The Stranger. The power of Camus' book to inspire strong responses in Nazi-occupied France, in post-war America, in modern-day Algeria is proof of its strength. As long as people keep reading novels, The Stranger will live on, and that is more of a guarantee of an afterlife than any author and most books can hope for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we turn to our question discussion period. We have a few ground rules. If you'd wait to be called on, wait for the microphone to reach you. Use the microphone. We're being recorded, and if you don't use it, posterity will not know your question. And please identify yourself. So who will start us off? Right up here. You need a microphone in the front. Up. Thanks.
Hi.
1 second. Is that mic on?
It's not on.
But this one will be.
Hi, my name's Julia Abrahams. I have no affiliation. I wanted to know how your experience with your publishing companies and your experience with your critics influenced your study of Camus' experiences with his publishers and his critics.
You mean my long duration experience? You know,
you as a published
as
author.
as a writer. So one of the things that allowed me to write this book was an experience of over 20 years in a writing workshop with novelists in North Carolina. And when I left North Carolina in 2009 and moved to Yale, I continued, thanks to the magic of Skype, I continued to attend this writing workshop. These are novelists, mostly doing Southern fiction, and they put up with me as a nonfiction writer. And I've learned so much from them about writing for image, and we read out loud. So I listen, I hear books being read out loud. I see writers going through the very difficult process of getting their books published. So it's given me a lot of insight into what it's like to try to get a first book published, which is what Camus had to do in 1942 when he was an absolutely unknown guy in the boondocks in Algeria. And so I think that was probably the key to my being able to imagine Camus' process.
And over here, Jim Banner. The microphone is coming. Eventually.
Professor Kaplan, thank you very much. I'm a great admirer of your book on Robert Bazillac, which I read some years ago. I carried Meursault with me in my mind and my heart and my pocket on the campus of Yale College in the 1950s, when it was suffused by the spirit of your predecessor, Henri Père, and my great teacher of history, Frank Baumer, in the history department. Then I was sent to France by the army, and I started to read Camus in French, even translated a bit of him, Le Retour à Tipasa, his wonderful essay, and I saw Les Possédés at the Odéon in Paris and so on. He was all over the place in France.
In the
and
50s.
Then, of course, he went quiet. 57 to 58 to 1960, and I was in Verdun, where I was stationed, when the news came of his being killed in an auto accident. And I remember talking with my provincial friends, and then some more self-esteeming ones in Paris, of course, about Camus, and they were very divided on their view of him. And this is what I want to ask you about, because what you've been talking about today is really, in part, about reputation.
Yes.
His work was certainly known, but his reputation suffered for those years when he fell silent because of the Algerian War, in which he was caught up on both sides, really. But my impression is, tell me if I'm wrong, that in recent years, because of your book, Existentialist Cafe, Tony Judd's work, where he elevates Camus above Sartre, far above Sartre, Olivier Todd's biography and so on, that Camus' reputation is now recovering, or is at its very height. Can you tell us, if I'm right, what the reasons for that are, and then stop being a historian for a minute, predict where it might go in the decades ahead?
You mean with my crystal ball? So how long do you have? First of all, homage to Henri Père. Did you take his course in the modern French novel? I'm now teaching the modern French novel with Maurice Samuels, and we think about Henri Père every day. You know, it's one of the most fascinating stories in all of literary history, the fortunes of Camus and how low they sunk at the height of post-colonial literature after Edward Said published Orientalism and said that, you know, Camus' Décor was just sort of a pretentious effort to cast European metaphysics in Algeria. And he was really so disdained, in fact, that Patrick McCarthy wrote a biography and said Camus' work had absolutely no staying power, that in fact he hadn't even been in the resistance, really. I mean, it was so bad that the Camus family sued. So that book, I'm not sure if it appeared in France or not. He had gone to Algeria in 1956 to plead for a civilian truce, and was booed by the ultras, you know, who called for his death. And then he discovered that the people who had been in the truce movement with him had already joined the FLN, so they had already gone over to a violent solution. And it was after that that he went silent. But he didn't completely go silent, because he was sending letters to the President of the Republic trying to save Algerian politicos from the guillotine. He didn't succeed. There were many, many death sentences in those years. Now, what happened from this low point? You're right. I mean, you've got the bibliography at the tip of your fingers. I mean, Judd, really important. A book by David Carroll called Camus the Algerian, trying to understand Camus' commitment and so on. But for me, there's one event that restored Camus to our affections, and that is the book he was writing when he died in the car crash that was discovered in his briefcase in the wreck of the car, The First Man. The First Man could not be published in 1960. The family just decided that in an atmosphere where Algeria was getting its independence, the story of a little French boy in Algeria would just be booed. So they kept it. They kept the manuscript. It was very difficult to establish the text because the handwriting was like that. And then 34 years later, this book came out. It was like a message in a bottle. I mean, I remember being with the Algerian writer Asia Jabar, and right after it had come out, and she said, "Oh my God, I have the feeling for the first time of being invited into the home of a poor pied noir boy." It gave people the impression, so many of Camus' books are, well, not tipaza, those early lyrical essays, but so many of the books are very controlled and even cool. The fall is very bitter. But here's this book that's really full of feeling, and not all he hasn't been able to work over the sentences. So you feel like you're getting it's an illusion of literature, but you feel like you're really getting the real guy. And this book turned around Camus studies completely. And suddenly, from 94 on, the situation changed. Sartre went down, the Sartre stock went down, the Camus stock went up. You're asking me about my crystal ball and what's going to happen in the future. I think Sartre, it's about time for a Sartre revival, because he's been really rejected for being only a political writer, and it's just not true. There's much more going on in Sartre. But I imagine that Camus will keep strong. I mean, I just taught a freshman seminar on Camus, and he really speaks to young people. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question.
Right there in the back, and then we'll come to the front.
Hi, John Garrity. I was caught by the date of the original publication, 1942, in the depths of World War II.
Yeah.
And why would the German occupation authorities allow something like this to be published, or what were the basic rules of the censorship board?
Yeah.
Of the
That's
occupation?
a really great question, and I have a whole chapter of my book called Gallimard's War, where I go into all the situation. Gerhard Heller was the head of the Propagandastaffel, and he said, it's hard to know whether he was saying this stuff after the war so he wouldn't, get in trouble, but he claimed he read, it was sent to him by the publisher, he read it, and he was completely taken with it. And what he wrote was, this novel's completely apolitical, it's fine to publish it. It's kind of, I think really what it means was, because there were no Jews in the novel, because there were no allies in the novel, and because there were no attacks on Nazis, it was fine. I mean, the censorship, as I can see it, the censorship was not highly intelligent. It was just a few automatic rules. So when Camus wanted to publish right after, a year after, he wanted to publish The Myth of Sisyphus, and there was a chapter in The Myth of Sisyphus on Kafka. And Gallimard wrote to him and said, you got to take out the Kafka chapter, because this will never get through. And that would have been censored. So Camus had one of those ethical dilemmas that people love to debate about the occupation. He removed the Kafka chapter, he substituted a chapter on Dostoevsky, and then he published the Kafka chapter in the Free Zone in a magazine called L'Arbalète. So he didn't, get rid of the Kafka. And then as soon as the war ended, the Kafka was reintegrated into The Myth of Sisyphus. But those were the kind of issues. And some of the issues were just about paper supply. I mean, paper was really in short supply. And Gallimard managed to save itself by living on its backlist. It had never shredded any of its books, and it had a lot of books in warehouses, and it was able to publish those. But they're pretty fascinating books published about how the censorship worked.
Thank you, Benjamin, to a retired bureaucrat. Could you tell us something, your take on Susan Sontag's takedown of Camus, and also tell us where your workshop in North Carolina was.
Is Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, yeah, led by a novelist named Laurel Goldman. Yeah, I mean, Susan Sontag reviewed Camus' diaries. Camus published these work-in-progress diaries that are very interesting. They're not confessional at all. They're really work-in-progress diaries, and I made extensive use of them in trying to reconstruct what he went through as he was writing The Stranger. She published a review for the New York Review of Books on one of the later volumes of the diaries. And she really liked being in the know. And she was a Sartrean. I mean, she had absorbed Sartre's disdain. I mean, one of the things I didn't say in my talk is that after being so close with Camus, Sartre broke with Camus over a number of things, including attitudes towards the Communist Party, the Algerian War. Sartre was a real supporter of the Front de Libération Nationale. But the thing that amuses me the most in Susan Sontag's takedown is she says there's some writers who are lovers and some writers who are husbands. And Camus, like a husband. He's sort of like well-meaning and earnest and maybe a little boring, which is hysterical because Camus is the greatest, lover, extramarital lover of all of 20th century French literature. So that was a kind of double put down, I think, on her part.
So I'm going to ask a question. You just mentioned the break with Sartre in part over the Communist Party, but Camus from 35 to 37 runs in pretty red circles
He's a
in
member of the
Algeria.
Communist Party. He's
An activist. He has political plays. He speaks in theaters. Then he breaks.
Well, he's actually
Ejected. But if we didn't know that,
Yeah.
reading the novel, at least this reader, wouldn't know that he had any exposure to, much less immersion in, that world. And many an ex-communist writer, it seems quite visible in their writing that they're writing against the Communist Party, but at least in my non-trained, non-literary critic eyes, I don't see that here. And so I would not have guessed, had I not known from your book that earlier kind of biographical engagement with the party, that had been part of his formative experience. So am I misreading this, or have people discerned the influence of those political years on the writing of this text?
Well, you're really asking me a question about how you read the politics of a novel. I mean, first I'd say he starts writing this in 1939. He's been out of the Communist Party for a number of years. The theater experiment, he actually starts a new theater troupe. If you want to understand that political Camus of the communist period, there's some good essays in the volume, Lyrical and Critical Essays, about, for example, he's trying to build the idea of a Mediterranean culture against this sort of right-wing Charles Maurras Mediterranean genius idea. I think the thing that was the most enabling for him in writing The Stranger, and I don't know if this is political or not, but we could probably take it that way, is his reading James M. Cain, The Postman Always Rings Twice, and getting this idea of a very flat narrator who speaks in the first person but doesn't let you in. The other place I would go to do a more political reading would be his representation of working class Algiers. I mean, it's set on the street where he grew up, the Rue de Lyon, where there's a huge parade of people, and you see Meursault looking out the window, out the balcony, and you see the various people coming through. I mean, it really has a sense of what that world, that very poor world, was like. And, he could have written, if he had been less political, I think he could have written what people were writing all the time in those days, a sort of a folklore version of Pied Noir life. And he wrote a pretty down and dirty representation of those people. I mean, the room of Raymond Santez, the stuff he's got on his wall, like one bottle of wine for each guy in the Boudin. To me, that's very much the work of a man who wanted to represent reality without rose-colored glasses.
Thank you. Right up here, Flip.
Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for the presentation. As a non-literature expert, I would like to ask a literature expert about something you talked about, different generations reading Camus differently, and then there's a question of how will the future look at him. And I wonder, is it not true of all the literature that we think of as great and that remains, that it's reinterpreted by succeeding generations, that what the author does in terms of the relationship of human beings with each other and to the world somehow resonates differently with successive generations? I was trying to think of anything that I would think of as a great work of literature that hasn't been reinterpreted that way. Is that off the wall, or is that your feeling?
No, I think that absolutely. One of the reasons I wanted to write a biography of the novel as opposed to a biography of Camus is that the author dies and the author's intentions die with her or him, but the book lives on. And the book the book lives on and changes quite a bit with every generation. But I have never seen a case where interpretation is so vastly different, where there's a high and there's a low, and Camus is the god and then he's the devil, and it's really, really dramatic. I suppose, you could do similar work on the Odyssey. You can do, every time you have a translation of a book, you've got a whole new interpretation. So I'm sure you could compare a Victorian translation of the Odyssey with Fitzgerald's translation of the Odyssey, and you would have completely different works. It's a little bit like, when you go to a museum and you see period rooms, you can sort of tell if you're looking at colonial America in a period room done in the 1950s, it looks like colonial America of the 1950s, And that's what's so fascinating about studying literary interpretation, because you've got these layers. That's what I really, really love about it. Yeah.
Dane Kennedy. Right here.
Thank you, Dane Kennedy. Fascinating talk and a fascinating book, which I read with great interest and pleasure. But as I was reading it, and I should say that I'm a historian of British colonialism, so I was reading it from that perspective, and I kept waiting, why is there no discussion of sort of the colonial experience, the colonial encounter, which seems so obvious from someone, from my perspective, reading the novel, which of course you do address in the last chapter and you're afterward and do it very well. But having done that, it's still striking to me that it isn't a topic of discussion
in France,
right, among any of these people,
right?
And partly I want you to sort of address that fact, and also I'm trying to think of it perhaps in another context. That may be that it's my error to think of it in the colonial context, and rather to think of it perhaps in the context of, say, the American racial experience, the American South, and the way in which that becomes sort of obscured for white people in America for a very long time. I don't know, but in any case,
we always like to think of the other guy as having bigger blinders on than we do.
Right, and so we have our own blinders. I don't know if that would be an appropriate analogy, but
those are really great ways in. I mean, I was shocked too, well, not so shocked, that here's Cyril Connolly in 1946, totally attuned to the colonial issues, very much politicized by what's going on in England. And of course, in 1946 in France, well, what's happened in Algeria is a huge massacre of Muslim veterans in Sétif, in the eastern part of the country. Scandalous, horrible massacre. And none of the French press are reporting on it, except Camus. He's aware of it. The country is completely preoccupied with Reconstruction. I mean, if you could see, the number of buildings destroyed, everything had to be rebuilt. It was a national obsession with restoring the infrastructure of France. So the idea that they weren't yet thinking about what was going to happen to them with the wars of decolonization in the late 50s and 60s. I mean, that I really understand. But it means they were behind. They were behind the British. They were, in a way, behind the Americans because, you know, people like Richard Wright and James Baldwin went to France, were friends with Camus, and they were very much aware of the racial othering. And that's why they went to France in the first place. So that Black American experience became a metaphor for a lot of French people, like Sartre and Beauvoir, for understanding. And sometimes they'd rather look at that than at their own situation. Yeah. It took me a long time to really figure it out. For a while I thought, before I had spent a lot of time working on Algeria, I had thought that it was an apartheid situation in Algeria. But it really wasn't. It's much more complicated than that. Yeah.
Jim?
A brief second crack. Which is the best translation into English of this book, in your view?
I teach the Matthew Ward translation. He was a young student of Richard Howard, who's probably the most eminent translation of literary modernism in the U.S. He's now a man in his late 80s. And Matthew Ward did an absolutely beautiful job, and he has a preface where he could skewer Stuart Gilbert but doesn't, and explains some of it. I really think that if Stuart Gilbert had read Sartre's essay on Camus, his famous 1943 essay called Explanation of the Stranger, Gilbert couldn't have done what he did. Sandra Smith has translated for Viking in 2013, but her translation isn't available in the US. You'd have to go to amazon.uk and change your settings to get it. But I think Matthew Ward is quite beautiful. I have a few quibbles with a few lines, but.
Yes.
Just a quick question. I said just a quick question.
Who are you? We want to know.
Joanna Brignolo is my name. Thank you. I'm always curious about the ego of individuals, and somehow it seems when translators, and when you read their notes, that they're countering an earlier translation. So it's just, I mean, it's a profession, I guess. They're happy to have every new translation because then they have a new query to keep investigating and to rebuttal. Because we are all different, we interpret differently. So, I mean, there's no end to it. It's just, it's something part of our nature, our DNA, I think, in human beings. So it's an endless conversation we have forever.
I mean, one of the mysteries, people say that a great work of art never grows old, but translations are dated within 20 years. That, to me, is something very mysterious and worth looking into. But I also do believe that translations are better than they used to be. People take translation much more seriously. A translator would never just cut a couple paragraphs or, go into a lot of paraphrase to explain something. There is respect for the text. So I do believe in some progress. I'm not quite as much a relativist as you are on the translation.
Well, I was at a de Beauvoir a session at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And I was so proud of the translators who said, we wished to follow her intent.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't we? Why
Yeah.
wouldn't someone?
Therefore,
it's driven by some other chemistry inside.
If you followed all the debates over the retranslation of The Second Sex, it's pretty fascinating because people complain that the first translation was really ignorant of existentialist philosophy. And then they claim that the second translation was too faithful and that it lost all its élan and panache. And so, you just throw your hands up, right?
One question. Microphone though.
Hi, I'm Claudine Schweber from University of Maryland, University College. This is a sidebar. The Financial Times, which you can see I'm addicted to, just had a series in their book section about new awards for translators, just what you're talking about. But the Booker Prize has just instituted this whole new category for translators, obviously of foreign languages. So when you were talking about that, I thought I'd give you that
Well, that's great.
and the recognition you're describing.
There's a prize right now being decided. You know, the French Cultural Services have opened a bookstore in their headquarters on Fifth Avenue called Albertine. And they have a prize judged by the people, you can go online and vote. Yeah, and the choices are really, really interesting. My favorite book on the list is a book by Mélisse de Carongal called Réparer les Vivants. It's translated as The Heart. And it's takes place in 24 hours, and it's a book about, well, I won't give it away, but it involves heart surgery. It sounds like nothing, and it is absolutely gripping.
Excellent. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, we'll do final comment then. Yeah.
I'm Susan Rappaport, unaffiliated, but I do arrange speakers at the Alliance Française here in Washington. If any of you want to come to listen to our talks, we hope to have Alice Kaplan. I wanted to say that I'm friends of Connie Board and Sheila Malovany, very close, and who translated Simone de Beauvoir for the second time. And they really tried to make it more up-to-date and more readable than the retired zoology professor from Smith who didn't speak French, who did the translation. And I was also at the panel where they were a couple of weeks ago. It was very interesting because they tried to keep to the intent of the author and yet make it more visible. But I don't think it's lost its élan.
That's good.
It's hard to read it straight through, but it's
such
an
an
amazing
important book.
It's
so
still
important.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
One other comment I wanted to say is that when people criticized Camus for not leaving Paris, I remember he said
Not leaving Paris.
during the war, he was mostly with combat, in and out.
Yes.
But sometimes he said it's harder to say yes than to say no.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if that's our last question, I'd like to bring this session to a conclusion with a reminder about next week's seminar by Greg Brzezinski on Winning the Third World, Sino-American Competition During the Cold War, with thanks to all of you for joining us, and with great thanks. Yes, thank you. With a great thanks to Alice Kaplan for a just thrilling afternoon session here. I learned a lot, and so thank you. Let's give her a round of applause. You're invited to a small reception outside, and books are for sale, yes.
So before you're inundated with people,
Oh, my goodness.
if I could just trouble you.
Eric, right?
Yes, that was